Born of laughter, clothed in cheer, happiness has brought you here. That is the first thing that Queen Clarion says to Tinker Bell when she first arrives in Pixie Hollow. I think the first thing I should explain is why I chose a song from Tinkerbell, of all things, particularly when it has no mention of laughter, which is, as Polly said, what I'll be speaking about today. Um, First of all, I love Tinkerbell, and that's another children's story that I hold dear to my heart. And the other reason is when I was talking about this particular sermon that I'd be giving with Polly, and I finally reached the conclusion to talk about Amelia Bedelia. Somewhere along the way, I had this faint memory of this scene from the very first Tinkerbell movie, which came out when I was 3. So I don't know how I still remember this. I have to have watched it at some point after I was 3 years old. But the story goes that when a baby laughs for the very first time, a fairy is born. And that's kind of the connection to Tinkerbell that I made. And also just, I love that song. I love the way it makes me feel. I noticed my grandmother singing along to it. So I think it people do recognize it, and it's a song that just makes you feel good. So yeah, that's the connection to this sermon. I think the second thing I should talk about is why I decided to talk about Amelia Bedelia. I was originally going to talk about Harry Potter and my generation's affinity for escapism, and then my grandpa had a heart attack. For those of you who don't know, he's doing all right now. He's okay. But it was almost a week-long process of unknowns and high stress and lots of worrying, and it was a tough time. I believe it was either the first or the second day of this affair that my mom asked to just hang out with me and find some way to take our minds off of everything that was going on in our family. Normally we would look for a show or a movie to watch on Netflix or something, but my mom and I have this interesting pattern of not liking any movies that the other likes. So so I thought I'd go with a book instead. Knowing that I was going to be doing this sermon soon, I had taken out some of the children's books that really I held close to my heart from the garage, and I was looking through them and I found 3 Amelia Bedelia books. And so I had this memory of when I was little, any time that there was a clouded day, like anytime that my mind was clouded or I had a tough day, I would go back and read these, or I would ask my parents to read them to me, because it was just an innocent book and it made me laugh and it made me feel okay again. And I can't say for certain, but I think I got to a point where we read it so often it became annoying, because she makes some mistakes. So reading that over and over again, wonder if you're teaching your children the right thing. But long story short, it was a really good experience. Reading the book took our minds off of everything that was going on, and we just sat laughing with each other. It was really healing. So I wanted to convey that to you guys. I wanted the main body of this sermon to be reading Amelia Bedelia, because I know that everyone always has something going on. Even if it's in the back of their minds, there's always something that's kind of clouding the back of our heads. And I just want to be able to take a break from that this morning and just laugh together. Funnily enough, I'm actually talking about escapism anyway. We're escaping into the simplicity of the power of laughter. So I guess I talked about escapism anyways. This is Good Work, Amelia Bedelia. And I will be doing voices. Feel free to laugh at me for that. It only adds to the sermon. Amelia Bedelia, called Mr. Rogers. Is the coffee ready? Coming right up, said Amelia Bedelia. She poured a cup of coffee. She took it into the dining room. There, said Amelia Bedelia. Would you like something more? Yes, said Mr. Rogers. toast and an egg. Fine, said Amelia Bedelia. She went into the kitchen. Very quickly, Amelia Bedelia was back. Mr. Rogers picked up the egg. Confound it, Amelia Bedelia, he said. I didn't say a raw egg. But you didn't say to cook it, said Amelia Bedelia. Mr. Rogers threw down his napkin. Oh, go fly a kite, he said. Amelia Bedelia looked surprised. All right, she said, if you say so. Soon Amelia Bedelia was out in a field. She had a kite. Now that was nice of Mr. Rogers, she said. I do love to fly kites. But I better get back. Mrs. Rogers might need me. Sure enough, Mrs. Rogers was calling. Amelia Bedelia. Here I am, said Amelia Bedelia. There's a lot to do, said Mrs. Rogers. Do you know how to make bread? I make good cornbread, said Amelia Bedelia. No, I want white bread, said Mrs. Rogers. You're a good cook. Just do what the recipe says. All right, said Amelia Bedelia. Here's a list of the other things I want you to do, said Mrs. Rogers. I'll be out until dinner time. Don't worry, said Amelia Bedelia. I'll get everything done. Mrs. Rogers left. I'll start with that bread, said Amelia Bedelia. She read the recipe. Do tell, she said. I never knew bread did magic things. Amelia Bedelia got everything she needed. Quickly, she mixed the dough. Amelia Bedelia set the pan on the table. Now, she said, you're supposed to rise. This I've got to see. Amelia Bedelia sat down to watch. But nothing happened. Maybe you don't like to be watched. I'll come back, said Amelia Bedelia. Let's see. Amelia Bedelia got her list. Clean out the ashes in the parlor fireplace. Fill the wood box. Amelia Bedelia went into the parlor. She cleaned out the ashes, and Amelia Bedelia filled the wood box. That's done, said Amelia Bedelia. What's next? She read, pot the window box plants. Put the pots in the parlor. Amelia Bedelia went outside. She counted the plants. Then she went into the kitchen. My goodness, she said, I need every pot for this. So she took them all. Amelia Bedelia potted those plants, and she took them inside. Now, I better tend to that bread, said Amelia Bedelia. She went into the kitchen, but the bread still sat on the table. Now look here, she said. You're supposed to rise. Then I'm supposed to punch you down. How can I punch you down if you don't rise? Amelia Bedelia sat down to think. Maybe that pan is too heavy, she said. I better help it rise. Amelia Bedelia got some string. She worked for a bit, and that bread began to rise. That should be high enough, said Amelia Bedelia. I'll just let you stay there a while. Amelia Bedelia picked up her list. Make a sponge cake. Amelia Bedelia read that again. I know a lot about cakes, she said, but I've never heard tell of that. But if she wants a sponge cake, I'll make her a sponge cake. Amelia Bedelia put a little bit of this and a little bit of that into some bowl. She mixed and mixed. Now for the sponge, she said. Amelia Bedelia got a sponge. She snipped it into small pieces. There, she said, into the cake you go. Soon the sponge cake was baking. I don't think Mr. Rogers will like this cake, said Amelia Bedelia. I'll make my kind of cake too. He does love butterscotch icing. So Amelia Bedelia baked another cake. There now, she said. I'll surprise him. Amelia Bedelia put the butterscotch cake in the cupboard. She put the sponge cake on the shelf. My, this is a busy day, said Amelia Bedelia. Let's see what's next. Call Alkaloo. Ask him to patch the front door screen. Amelia Bedelia shook her head. Alkaloo can't patch anything, she said. I better do that myself. She got what she needed. And Amelia Bedelia patched that screen. Amelia Bedelia looked at the time. Oh, she said, I better get dinner started. Let me see what she wants. She read the list. A chicken dinner will be fine. Amelia Bedelia shook her head. What will she think of next? She said. Well, that won't take long to fix. Amelia Bedelia got everything ready. She set the table. Then she sat down to rest. Soon Mr. and Mrs. Rogers came home. Amelia Bedelia, yelled Mr. Rogers. Coming, said Amelia Bedelia. What is that awful cloth on the front door? Said Mrs. Rogers. You said to patch the screen, said Amelia Bedelia. Can't patch without a patch. They went into the parlor. Oh, my good pots, said Mrs. Rogers. And the bad ones, too, said Amelia Bedelia. Mr. Rogers looked at the wood box. He shook his head, but he didn't say a word. They went into the kitchen. The sponge cake is pretty, said Mrs. Rogers. At least that's done right. Something caught Mr. Rogers' eye. He looked up. What in tarnation is that? He said. The bread, said Amelia Bedelia. I plumb forgot it. Do let me punch it down quick. She climbed up on a chair. Amelia Bedelia began to punch. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers just stared. The bread plopped to the floor. Did I see what I thought I saw? Said Mr. Rogers. You did, said Mrs. Rogers. Now, said Amelia Bedelia, dinner is ready when you are. Well, you can cook, said Mrs. Rogers. Dinner should be good. I hope so, said Mr. Rogers. I'm hungry. Just serve the plate, said Mrs. Rogers. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers sat at the table. Amelia Bedelia brought in the plates. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers stared at the plates. But that's cracked corn. It's all kinds of awful things, said Mrs. Rogers. You said chicken dinner, said Amelia Bedelia. That's what chickens eat for dinner. Mrs. Rogers was too angry to speak. Take this mess away, said Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Rogers said, serve the cake and coffee. Amelia Bedelia did. Mr. Rogers took a big bite of cake. He spluttered and spit it out. What in tarnation is that? He said. Sponge, said Amelia Bedelia. Mrs. Rogers said to make a sponge cake. Suddenly, Mr. Rogers laughed. He roared. Mrs. Rogers looked at the lumpy cake. Then she laughed too. But I'm still hungry, said Mr. Rogers. I can fix that, said Amelia Bedelia. I have a surprise for you. Oh no, said Mr. Rogers. I can't stand another one, said Mrs. Rogers. Amelia Bedelia brought in milk and her butterscotch cake. Ah, said Mr. Rogers. Hurry, said Mrs. Rogers. Give me some. Soon the whole cake was gone. How do you do it, said Mr. Rogers. 1 minute we're hopping mad at you, and the next we know we can't do without you, said Mrs. Rogers. Amelia Bedelia just smiled. I guess I understand your ways, she said. That's the end of the book. So at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that I picked out the Tinkerbell song because it talks about fairies being born of laughter. But the other reason is because the whole point of my sermon is that I found when times start to get tough and the whole world seems like it will never right itself, returning to those things that brought us joy, like this book, like Tinkerbell, the things that make us laugh, it's a good way to relieve some of those burdens. And children's books and movies in general just kind of tell us the things that matter in life in a simple way, and sometimes that's what we need. Part of what I love about Amelia Bedelia is the creativeness of the author. I mean, if I had looked at a list that said make a chicken dinner, I would never have thought to put cracked corn on a plate. I don't know how the author did that. I don't know how the author came up with that, but I appreciate that creativity, and I appreciate that it made me laugh, and that I think it made you guys laugh as well. I hope that later on, if life ever throws something like what happened a couple weeks ago at me again, I can remember that there are these books, that there are these movies that make me feel good. And I hope that you guys can remember that as well. I hope that whatever book, whatever movie, whatever story stuck with you, if life ever seems impossible, return to those stories. It'll make you happy. It'll make you laugh. It'll make the world seem right again. And yeah, that's my message.